But our job is to promote fairness in sports.
Our job.
Biological males are not going to be allowed to compete against biological females. Why don't you go to Amazon and buy a spine online and take a stand?
In February 2025, the NCAA rolled out a new policy banning athletes assigned male at birth from competing in women's sports, perfectly aligning with an executive order from President Donald Trump. Now, let's rewind to 2 months ago, when the current NCAA president got absolutely grilled by Senator Hawley. The fact that this was even a debate is wild. Just goes to show that people will enforce anything if it comes stamped with the right authority.
Thanks, Senator Schiff. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Baker, if I could just start with you. I confess I didn't understand your answer to Senator Kennedy's question about the safety of women in the sports of the NCAA overseas. Did you say the federal law requires the NCAA to permit biological men to play in women's sports?
No, I said there have been 5 cases in federal court in the past 18 months. And
okay, because I thought you told him that
federal judges sided with participation.
The reason the NCAA couldn't take a position on this, in fact, you have taken a position on it, you're affirmatively permitting biological men in women's sports. But you said to him it's because of federal law. There's no federal law that requires it, right? The relevant federal law is Title IX, is it not? You're familiar with Title IX.
If guidance on this issue from Title IX or guidance with respect to discrimination law would be
Title
important.
IX is already the law. Title IX says
federal judges have ruled on
20 U.S.C. Section 1681A. By the way, let's just dispense with that canard. No federal court has ordered the NCAA to include biological men in women's sports, right?
Actually,
there's not a single case that has ordered the NCAA to do so, correct?
That's pretty much what they decided in the San
No, don't say
Jose
pretty
case.
much. We're talking about the law here.
Yes,
and
I know.
And you actively dissembled to Senator Kennedy just a second ago. It's not true that the NCAA has been ordered by any court, number one. It's not true that federal law requires you to include biological males. In fact, Title IX explicitly says no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be denied the benefits of any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. You are in court at this moment arguing that Title IX doesn't apply to the NCAA, which is astounding to me, given the amount of money, federal money, the NCAA gets. But let me just ask you this.
Senator,
a total of 5 teams, 5 women's volleyball teams, Wyoming, Southern Utah, Utah State, Nevada, and Boise State all had to forfeit 7 games in their conference play, NCAA conference play this past year, women's teams, because a biological male, under your rules, was playing on a rival's team. How is that not denying them the benefits of the sport? Why is this fair to women?
And when that issue went to federal court, the judge sided with participation.
No, the NCAA did not go to court.
No,
that is not true.
The federal judge made the decision with respect to the issue you just raised.
Your rules have not been tried in federal court. And your rules explicitly permit biological males in women's sports. And I am asking you, why is that fair to the women? All of these women on these teams had to forfeit games and therefore a chance to compete in the championship because of your rules. And I want to know, why is that protective of women? That's my question.
So far, the federal government on the court side has issued decisions several times.
No, I'm not asking you about the
year.
courts. I know what the courts have done. Not one of them
that's
has
their
ordered the
interpretation of
NCAA.
federal law.
This is your policy, which you will not defend because, frankly, it's indefensible. Why are you, Mr. Baker, why are you allowing biological men to play in women's sports?
Because we believe that's consistent with federal policy.
So we're right back to your testimony is you believe you're compelled to do it by federal law. You would change it otherwise?
We believe our policy. I said in my opening comments to Senator Kennedy, the clarity on this issue at the federal level would be very helpful.
Oh, that is such a cop-out. In other words, somebody else please do it for us. Keep sending us the money. We'll go to court and argue that Title IX doesn't even apply to us.
We do not take a dime in federal money. Not a dime.
Is that why you're arguing Title IX doesn't apply to you?
Yes, part of it, yes.
You honestly think you shouldn't be subject to Title IX?
We don't believe we currently are. Federal court has
amazing.
Federal court has affirmed
Absolutely
that on a number
amazing.
Of
You have a pending lawsuit right now from female athletes who are suing you because you allow biological men not only in their sports but also in their locker rooms. Why do you do that, by the way? Why do your guidelines allow biological men into women's locker rooms without the women's consent? Without the women's foreknowledge? Why do you do that?
That's not what our guidelines say.
They do say that. I've got them right here. Your guidelines say that transgender student athletes should be able to use the locker room, shower, and toilet facilities in accordance with their gender identity.
And
here they are, right here.
And then everybody else should have an opportunity to use other facilities if they wish to do so.
Okay, so the burden's on the women. So if the women then want to move to a different facility, in other words, if they want to abandon their own locker room, you're saying that they should have to do that? So, in other words, it's their problem?
No, we put a significant amount of emphasis on what the locals' plans are, and we make sure that everybody.
What does that mean? The locals' plans?
Whoever it is that's hosting the event.
You have guidelines that instruct them what the best practices are, and your guidelines say that biological men can go in and use the women's locker rooms if they want to. What the women want has nothing to do with it. They're not mentioned in here at all. Correct? Correct. It's right here. You just reaffirmed them in May of this year. I've got them. I'm reading them. I've got them off your website.
I believe our guidelines give people optionality with respect to how they choose to use their facilities. And many,
what does that even mean? Optionality. What it says is transgender student athletes will be able to use the locker room, shower, and toilet in accordance with their gender identity. That means men will be able to use the women's locker rooms. And as Riley Gaines and others have testified before this committee, that means if a man, a biological man, wants to use their locker room, they just have to accept it. Or else the women have to go somewhere else. They've got to go find an alternative. Why is that fair?
We told the local folks who've hosted our tournaments they need to create accommodations for the people who are playing.
You know, so it's the feds on the one hand, it's the locals on the other hand. The only person who doesn't seem to bear any responsibility in this is you and the NCAA, who are the governing body. And your testimony here today is you're not even subject to Title IX. Mr. Baker, I can't tell you how disappointed this makes me, but not just disappointed, frankly, infuriated for the student athletes who are suffering because of your policies, and you won't even defend them. You won't even take responsibility. It's outrageous. It's totally outrageous.
Expired.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. About 90% of my personal philosophy is don't hurt someone unless they're trying to hurt you. Don't take other people's stuff. And leave me alone. So I'm pretty libertarian when it comes to gambling. Within reason, if someone wants to gamble, they can. But I do want to ask you this, Mr. Rebote. Can you name me one form of legalized gambling where the House doesn't have a decided advantage?
The gambling industry always has the advantage, as you are correctly indicating.
Okay.
The point is that the consumers know that.
That's. I'm sorry to cut you off. I just don't have much time. Governor Baker, the NCAA exists in part to promote fair competition in collegiate sports, does it not? Yes. Could you speak in the mic for me?
Yes.
Okay. A transgender woman is a biological male. Is that correct?
Yes.
And a biological male is always going to have a physical and a physiological advantage competing in a collegiate sport against a biological female. Isn't that true?
There's not a lot of research on it, but it's certainly debatable.
You think it's debatable?
I think it's debatable.
You don't think? Think that a biological male has an advantage every time competing against a biological female? Is that your testimony?
No, I think defined the way you defined it, yes, I would agree with you.
So you agree with me?
Yes.
Okay. So why does the NCAA, why do you, your job is to promote fairness in collegiate sports. Why do you support allowing transgender women who are biological males to compete against non-transgender biological females?
Over the course of the past 2 years, 5 federal court cases involving this question. Let me finish. 5 federal judges have all sided with participation as the standard. This is a very...
So you're saying you don't have a choice?
I'm saying that under the current dynamic, there is not clarity on this issue legally.
Well, why don't you exhibit leadership and demonstrate leadership and provide clarity? If you agree with me,
well, first of all,
that the purpose of the NCAA is to promote fair competition, and if you agree with me that in every single instance a biological male is going to have an unfair advantage over a biological female, then why don't you just say, look, in America you can be whomever you want to be, but in terms of fair competition in a collegiate sport, transgender women who are biological males are not going to be allowed to compete against non-transgender women who are biological female. Boom, done. Why don't you take that position, Charlie?
Because federal courts have already taken the position that they do have the right to compete.
Yeah,
5 times in the past year and a half.
You can disagree and be sued. Why don't you demonstrate some leadership?
I would love to work with you folks on creating clarity around this question.
I'm sorry, but look, I'm sure the NCAA is a good organization. I just can't figure out what you folks are good for. I know you take in bucket loads of money and you share some of it. You make that money off the backs of these kids. Your predecessor, who was a good man, took home $2.8 million a year in salary. I'm not going to ask you what you make, but I bet you didn't take a pay cut. You take in bucket loads of money. We got problems in collegiate sports with the transfer portal and the NIL and now gambling and biological males, you allowing biological males to compete against biological females. And you folks at the NCAA don't do anything except sit there, watch, cash your checks, and suck on your teeth.
I would argue that we've made a lot of progress on a bunch of those
Why don't
issues.
you take a position on transgender biological males competing against females? You just told me it wasn't fair.
There's a federal standard on this is one that we would work with you on if you wish to work on it.
Why don't you do it on your own?
Because we're a national governing body and we follow federal law.
That's what you're there for. Why don't you stand up and say in front of God and country, federal law is wrong, and the NCAA believes in fair competition. We also believe in equality. If you want to, in America, you can be whatever you want to be. You can be whomever you want to be. But our job is to promote fairness in sports.
Our job.
Biological males are not going to be allowed to compete against biological females. Why don't you go to Amazon and buy a spine online and take a stand?
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. Next is Senator from Vermont.
Here's a stark and troubling insight into the ongoing debate surrounding the participation of biological males in women's sports, as well as the broader implications for fairness, safety, and the rights of female athletes. It is impossible to ignore the glaring inconsistencies, lack of leadership, and outright disregard for the integrity of women's sports demonstrated by the NCAA and its representatives, particularly in this exchange. This discussion is not merely about sports. It is about the preservation of fairness, the protection of women's rights, and the defense of common sense in the face of ideological overreach. At the heart of this issue is the question of fairness. The NCAA, an organization ostensibly dedicated to promoting fair competition in collegiate sports, has failed to uphold its own mission. By allowing biological males to compete in women's sports, the NCAA is actively undermining the very principles it claims to champion. As Senator Kennedy aptly pointed out, biological males have inherent physical and physiological advantages over biological females. This is not a matter of opinion, but a scientific fact. Testosterone levels, bone density, muscle mass, and other physiological factors give biological males a significant edge in athletic competition. To pretend otherwise is to deny reality and to sacrifice the integrity of women's sports on the altar of political correctness. The NCAA's representative, Mr. Baker, attempted to deflect responsibility by claiming that federal law and court decisions have tied the organization's hands. This is a disingenuous argument. As the transcript reveals, no federal court has explicitly ordered the NCAA to allow biological males to compete in women's sports. Title IX, the federal law designed to prevent sex-based discrimination in educational programs, including athletics, explicitly states that no person shall be denied the benefits of any educational program or activity on the basis of sex. Yet, the NCAA is twisting this law to justify policies that directly harm female athletes. By allowing biological males to compete in women's sports, the NCAA is effectively denying female athletes the opportunity to compete on a level playing field, thereby violating the spirit, if not the letter, of Title IX. What is even more egregious is the NCAA's refusal to take responsibility for its policies. Mr. Baker's testimony is a masterclass in evasion and obfuscation. He repeatedly shifted blame to federal courts, local organizers, and even the lack of clarity in federal law. This is not leadership, it is cowardice. The NCAA is a powerful organization with significant influence over collegiate sports. If it truly believed in fairness and equality, it would take a stand to protect female athletes. Instead, it has chosen to capitulate to ideological pressures, sacrificing the rights and opportunities of women in the process. The consequences of the NCAA's policies are not abstract. They are real and deeply damaging. The transcript highlights the case of 5 women's volleyball teams that were forced to forfeit games because a biological male was allowed to compete on a rival team. These female athletes were denied the chance to compete fairly and to pursue their dreams. This is not an isolated incident, but part of a growing trend that threatens to erode the integrity of women's sports. When biological males are allowed to compete in women's sports, it is not just a matter of fairness, it is a matter of safety. Female athletes are being put at risk, both physically and emotionally, by policies that prioritize ideology over common sense. The NCAA's guidelines on locker room usage further illustrate the organization's disregard for the rights and dignity of female athletes. By allowing biological males to use women's locker rooms and facilities, the NCAA is imposing an unacceptable burden on female athletes. Women should not have to forfeit their privacy and comfort to accommodate the demands of a misguided ideology. The fact that the NCAA's guidelines place the burden on women to find alternative facilities if they are uncomfortable is a clear indication of where the organization's priorities lie, and it is not with the well-being of female athletes. However, there is a glimmer of hope on the horizon. In February 2025, the NCAA announced a new policy that prohibits athletes assigned male at birth from competing in women's sports. This policy aligns with an executive order from President Donald Trump, who has consistently championed the protection of women's rights and the integrity of women's sports. This decisive action represents a significant step forward in restoring fairness and common sense to collegiate athletics. It is a clear rejection of the ideological extremism that has plagued the NCAA and a reaffirmation of the principles of fairness and equality. The broader implications of this issue cannot be ignored. This is not just about sports. It is about the erosion of women's rights and the normalization of policies that prioritize ideology over reality. The NCAA's capitulation to these pressures sets a dangerous precedent. If biological males are allowed to compete in women's sports, what other areas of life will be subject to similar ideological overreach? The rights of women, hard-won through decades of struggle, are being undermined in the name of inclusivity. This is not progress, it is regression. We must stand firm in defense of fairness, common sense, and the rights of women. The NCAA's previous policies were a betrayal of these principles. However, the new policy announced in February 2025, in alignment with President Trump's executive order, is a welcome and necessary change. In conclusion, the NCAA's failure to protect female athletes was a disgrace. By allowing biological males to compete in women's sports, the organization was undermining fairness, safety, and the rights of women. Thankfully, the new policy announced in February 2025, in alignment with President Trump's executive order, represents a significant step forward, and the fact this even happened should serve as a warning.